Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
I'm Rick Hanson. I'm a neuropsychologist. Been married a long time, 2 young adult kids. I'm the primary author of a book that's fairly well known at this point, Buddha's Brain, the Practical Neuroscience of Happiness, Love, and Wisdom. And I'd say also I have a background in contemplative practice. I started meditating in 1974, off and on since then, mostly on the last 10 years or so. And I have a special interest, a particular interest in practical methods, useful things found at the intersection of psychology, brain science, and contemplative practice, especially Buddhism, which is the form of contemplative practice that I know best and has also had the most intersection with Western science.
So what I'm looking at is focusing on the topic of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So how does empathy inform your work?
Well, first, it's important to think about how we mean that word, empathy. Maybe I'll swing back to that in a second. The short answer is I'm a practicing therapist. So I'm a clinician. I'm a methods guy. I'm not someone who does research. I'm someone who consumes a lot of research and especially thinks about how does it integrate in a useful way, and then how do we mine it for applications. So that's kind of what I do. So whether I'm being a husband or being a dad or in particular being a therapist, I'm very engaged in the life of empathy. For example, earlier today I was talking with a couple about the importance of them having more empathy with each other with regard to their differences about approaches to parenting. So I'm very caught up that way. More broadly, I think looking out at the world today, we have a crisis of empathy in a way. When we were hunter-gatherer bands living in the Serengeti or spreading out across the world, 100,000 years ago, say, it didn't really matter in a global sense that Band A, comprised of 50 to 150 members, did not have much empathy for Band B, which also had 50 to 150 members. And in our history, it's useful to appreciate how much violence there was between bands. Just to put that in perspective, in the 20th century, it's calculated roughly that about 1 male in 100 died due to warfare. That's a lot, right? 1% during the 20th century with 2 world wars, 2 atomic bombs, a lot of other stuff going on. Well, in hunter-gatherer cultures, both existing ones today and those that are good approximations of the ones in which we evolved throughout history, the estimates are that roughly 12 to 15% of males died due to violence, mainly between bands, some within bands. So if you think about that, that's 12 to 15 times the death rate due to wars in what many people consider the bloodiest century we've ever had. So sometimes we tend to romanticize or sentimentalize life in the clan of the cave bear days, but there was a lot of violence between groups. So we evolved to have, in a nutshell, empathy for us and very quick turning off of empathy for them. Well, when you have a global economy, when you have weapons of mass destruction that are very easy to obtain or generally available one way or another, when you have groups pushed up hard against each other, when you have a planet edging towards 7 billion people altogether, those old ways of being in which we could readily just turn off empathy for anyone we defined as them or other, not us, that's really problematic. And so I have a lot of interest in how in the world, to use your phrase, we do build a culture of empathy. And we use that as a major piece of the puzzle, a major factor among several other major factors in helping kind of steer us away from the edge of the cliff where we're dancing right now.
So do you have some ideas about what we can do to address this deficit in empathy?
Mm-hmm.
Like how can we go about actually doing some things?
Well, I think there are a lot of levels of intervention, right? And I'm a therapist, so I tend to think about levels of intervention that have to do within the mind or within one person and another person. And there are other levels to intervene in that are more philosophical or more public policy focused, more media focused, let's say, more culturally focused. That's great. I'm not against them. I'm just focused on the ones that I'm particularly grounded in. Okay. So one, I think really helping people appreciate the skills of empathy. Empathy is a skilled act. We evolved three major neural systems that support different aspects of what empathy is. Specifically, empathy fundamentally is a kind of simulation over here of what it's like for the person over there. And we simulate actions. That's where those mirror neural networks come in. We simulate emotions over there. That's where the insula, which is a part of the brain, comes into play especially. And we simulate thoughts or mental activity broadly over there. And that's where what's called in developmental psychology theory of mind comes in, which is more grounded in the prefrontal cortex, particularly as it matures through later childhood into and adolescence into young adulthood. So we have these three systems, simulating actions, emotions, and thoughts. And just because we have those capabilities, though, just because we evolved the most empathic brain on the planet, doesn't mean we can use it, doesn't mean we're using it, right? And so I think helping people appreciate the skills of empathy and how to be more skilled in empathy is useful. I work with couples routinely where they really don't have very good empathy skills. And it's a matter of naming what those three circuits are and developing ways, which are in my book as well, to really turbocharge and stimulate those neural substrates of empathy, thereby strengthening them. Because in the saying from the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb, neurons that fire together wire together. That means that if you stimulate a neural substrate skillfully through mental activity that's targeted at it, you then strengthen that substrate, which improves that mental capacity over time. That's it in a nutshell. So I think one part of it is just teaching skills, and a key place to start, of course, is in childhood. So I really applaud and am very interested in school-based programs or other based programs that are aimed at kids. Teaching skills and making skills more available and accessible in the culture, I think, is also a really important thing. And talking about empathy and empathy skills is very important. A third thing I would really support is a carefulness about categorizing people as them. And I think there's a lot of that goes on via media. And as we become more thoughtful about the ways in which we tend to define us and them, red state, blue state, Shiite, Sunni, Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, Christian in Northern Ireland, say. In America these days, in terms of our cultural divide, are you a liberal or a conservative? And all these distinctions that we create can really shape the application of empathy, because in the brain, as soon as you distinguish between one group and another group, you immediately set up a kind of yellow flag condition for no empathy, or even worse, fearful aggression toward them. And then next level, if you feel at all threatened by them, oh boy, we're in a red flag condition. And then, to use an analogy, from the Native American teaching about the two wolves in the heart, one of love and one of hate, and everything depending on which one we feed every day. As soon as you make that distinction between us and them, that wolf of hate gets up and starts looking around, how's it going? And then, as soon as we feel threatened, and it's very easy to feel threatened, we're very vulnerable to feeling threatened. As soon as we feel threatened, boom, that wolf of hate is looking for someone to bite.
So it sounds like really one of the first things is just kind of finding these skills for teaching empathy, kind of maybe articulating a set of skills.
Yeah, I think learning the skills and then applying the skills, and then I think in a broader scale, really appreciating how easy it is for people to not be empathic, and watching the ways that empathy gets dropped out by this combination of, differentiation, if you will, separation between us and them, and then second, feeling threatened by them, frankly, often to a degree that's way out of proportion to the actual threat that's coming at us from them.
So it seems like it's an understanding of kind of the dynamics of empathy, then, to understand how empathy works and is an important component in helping to build empathy, perhaps.
I guess if I were to be crystal clear what I'm trying to say, I think that having the skills of empathy as a key component of emotional literacy, interpersonal literacy, be really understood and taught routinely is a very important thing. Taught routinely at the level of children, schools, taught routinely in people who are getting ready to get married, taught routinely in these programs in high schools for kids related to sex ed, and basically dating and stuff like that. Corporations, business settings, particularly when you have an increasingly diverse population as we do in America, and also, frankly, throughout the world with movement and diversities of all kinds, in corporate or business settings, it's really useful to have training in empathy skills. So that would be one. Two, I would have people be very trained in or educated in also the factors that undermine empathy, namely this differentiation between us and them, and second, the sense of being threatened, and oftentimes the manufacturing of seeming to be threatened by them. I would have that as well. The third thing I think is really important, which I think goes a lot to your work, is to appreciate the value of empathy, because I'm quite struck by the very common example of people who are wonderfully empathic and nurturing to us. I think, to use one among many examples, the conflicts in Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, and so forth, in which, or other areas where you have different ethnic groups, Hutus and Hutsis, what have you, or Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland who lived side by side, quite close to each other. They saw each other routinely. And very quickly they could shift from being wonderfully empathic and kind toward us, to being absolutely cold and cruel and brutal and devastating toward children and vulnerable people, who just happen to be quote unquote them. So it's important to appreciate how easy it is to not be empathic. Or at a basic level, I see it routinely in couples. People who were very empathic with each other. That's what drew them to each other and led them to get together, maybe walk down a wedding aisle and back again, right? And yet 5-10 years later, after a certain amount of this and that has happened, kids, changes, life, jobs, economic struggles, what have you, at that point they have very little empathy for each other. And the circle of us and them has shrunk to just having one person in it. So it's easy to not be empathic. It's really easy to turn off empathy. And so I think appreciating the importance of will when it comes to empathy is a key part of creating a culture of empathy at all levels, including worldwide.
Well, that's what I'm kind of looking at. If will, by you mean that you raise it to be a social value?
That's correct.
Yeah.
You have to value it. You have to see the point of empathy and take it on. I think at this point, it arises in people the wish to hit others, sometimes, some people. But it's normative across the board that we don't hit people, basically, as adults. Stuff happens, I mean by that in kind of informal senses. I'm not talking about state-supported or sanctioned, war and so forth. But pretty much it's normative not to hit people. So many exceptions to it, to be sure, but it's much more normative today than it was maybe 200 years ago in Western cultures. And people realize, oh, okay, I'm not supposed to do that. Or certain kinds of racial slurs that were casually, routinely uttered 50 years ago, certainly 200 years ago, now in polite company are considered anathema. The same thing. There can be an evolution of a value on certain ways of acting or conducting oneself. Routinely, when I was a kid, people would throw litter out the window of a car on the highway. Now, if you do that, people turn to you and go, what? Don't do that, right? Even adults to adults. So it's, again, there's a shift of consciousness in certain regards. I'd love to see the same thing with regard to empathy, that it's just considered bad manners, it's considered boorishness, it's considered immoral in a sense to drop out your empathy for another person. And one thing that's very important, I think, about that is to think of the balance of assertiveness and empathy. Because a major reason I observe or a major obstruction for people with regard to empathy is the thought that, well, if I'm really empathic, if I really open myself up to what it's like for the other person, I'm going to be waiving my rights. Or that's going to mean I agree with them. Or they're going to take it that I'm approving of them, when actually I'm really not. And no, you can be absolutely tuned into another person that you believe belongs behind bars. And there I have examples of that in my mind. I think I'll not mention, but who recently have held high office in America that literally have broken the law quite significantly and really belong behind bars. On the other hand, I have empathy for them. Maybe another example would be, I think, of Saddam Hussein, an absolutely brutal dictator, murdered tens of thousands of his own people, and yet, in the Second Gulf War, the net of it was that his own sons were killed. And while he was still alive, he had to know that. And I had empathy for him dealing with that, while simultaneously thinking that, in my own view, he should be in prison for life. So I think in a less dramatic ways, we can certainly have empathy for the people we're married to, or we live with, or we sleep with, or, our relatives, or we work with, or have a different political take than we do. We can be empathic toward them while simultaneously being very assertive, and if anything, more successfully assertive, because we understand them better and we understand what's driving them to do what they're doing.
Well, you're talking at a bit of an international and national level, and Barack Obama talked quite a bit about empathy and said he was going to choose a Supreme Court justice that had empathy, and so there was a real debate, actual attack on empathy by conservatives. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that debate that happened.
I think sometimes we have coded language, right? So it's like, well, we can take it at face value, or we can talk about what the coded language was probably really aiming at. And I'd say I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't think I have a lot to add to that. I think that what the issues, I suspect, is getting at is, how do we balance, judgments, even at the Supreme Court level, that are really based on, if you will, principle or rules or interpretations of language in the Constitution or in statutes and things of that sort. And how do we balance that with a human feeling for the people involved? And how that balance is struck, I think there are people who really specialize in that. I won't say much more than that, but I think that's the issue on the table, is how do we balance that? And my own view is you can do both. It's not either or. Maybe that's maybe that's my real point about that seeming controversy, that it's not a dichotomy. In other words, you can have a great deal of clarity for what the law says, and you can understand that your role is to implement the law as it's embodied, let's say, in the Constitution ultimately, while having enormous empathy for the people who will suffer, to put it a certain way, as a result of you doing your job and carrying out your job as it's constituted for you. I think both things can be completely true.
Okay, so kind of shifting to a little bit different angle, is I like to ask about metaphor. And if you had a metaphor for empathy, what would empathy be like? Often it's the definition of empathy is actually standing in someone else's shoes or looking through someone else's eyes. Mm-hmm. And those are just metaphors that have kind of become actually a definition.
Yeah.
Do you have a metaphor?
I'll tell you a couple that are in my mind. One is, I use the language of casting loose from the familiar moorings of our own opinions or identity to enter the deep waters of what it's like to be the other person, and to allow oneself to have enough confidence. This is where differentiation really supports empathy, and research has shown that people who have very porous boundaries and really almost who tend to merge with others actually have a hard time sustaining empathy. That empathy is like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which for me is the great Dharma story or the great teaching story of all time. Not too hot, not too cold, not too distant, not too close, is what really, it's the just right sweet spot that actually promotes empathy. So to enter the deep waters, if you will, of another person's thoughts and feelings and complex dynamics and how their childhood is shaping them and their gender and their temperament and their ethnicity and everything that travels with ethnicity and so forth, how all that's in the mix in this dynamic way, to really go into that world, you've got to have some confidence that you're not going to get swallowed up and never come out alive, right? So for me, it's to have the capacity to cast loose from your familiar moorings and allow yourself to be kind of swept by those different cross currents. and yet still have the confidence that you can come back to your familiar home base, as soon as you need to.
Mm-hmm. You had several metaphors. That was a great one, but I can see it, the swell of the boat moving
exactly.
up and down, kind of moving. It's a great metaphor.
You got to go. You got to go in that world. I guess another metaphor I think of is a little bit from Dantes Inferno, which you may recall. Dante the poet goes into the 7 circles of hell, and he has a guide with him, or someone who goes with him. The angel Virgil being a Roman poet from well over 1,000 years before, and so as Dante does that, and as he transits or goes through, he travels all kinds of territory, he has someone with him. And I think as I extend my arm out, it's like a friend or a companion who's with you as their arm across your shoulder, as they look out with you at what it's like to be you. Rather than, in effect, sitting over here going, I see you over there. Interesting. Whoa, that's trippy. Whoa, that's spooky. Or, whoa, that's really sweet and wonderful. I tend to visualize the territory of the psyche as a vast landscape with both lovely spring-dappled meadows with lovely flowers and very dark and smelly bogs. So one way to do empathy is to look over there and go, oh, I see that stuff over there. Another way is to jump over with the other person. Put your arm around their shoulder and look at their world through their eyes. I guess that would be another metaphor for empathy that I use.
And in your talks, I've heard your metaphors. I really enjoy them. So you've got a real talent for those metaphors. So in terms of a metaphor for the opposite of empathy, do you have any metaphor for that?
I think I have never really thought of that. I think of coldness immediately comes up, indifference, disdain. I'll tell you a photograph immediately comes to me. It's a real photograph, and it had to do when there was famine, I believe, in the Sudan, and it's an image of what you see in the foreground is the legs of a man walking off the field, out of the field of view of the picture. So actually from your perspective, looking this way, the man is walking that way. And in the center of the picture, in the background though, is another man, black African from Sudan, who's reaching up like this, toward the man who's walking away. And the caption says that this man on the ground who's weak from hunger has had his bag of rice just ripped from his hands by the man who's walking out of the frame of the camera. And when I think of the indifference of the man, walking out of the frame of the camera, who's just grabbed this food that was offered by UN or whatever it is, human rights groups, or not human rights groups, but aid groups of one kind or another, I think of the absolute indifference to the suffering of the man on the ground and the rights of the man on the ground to the bag of rice that had been given to him, that must have been in the mind of the man who just walks away.
Mm-hmm. So it's that indifference then, that those walls there. Mm-hmm.
I think also couples in my office. I mean, this is where I see couples. You're sitting in a chair right now where many couples have sat, and I think of people who fell in love, been married for a while, let's say, or other forms of commitment in their relationship, whether it's different sex couples or same-sex couples. But now, years later, there's this profound divide, and they can just simply look at each other while the other person is clearly suffering, and suffering due to them sometimes, and be so identified with and rooted in their personal case, about the other person or their own needs or how they've been wronged, that they can't separate enough from their own case or position or grievances to extend their heart to that other person, only to tune into what it's actually like for the other person. I think, which goes to a paradoxical point, that very often failures of empathy boil down to failures of autonomy. In other words, people don't have a grounded enough sense of me over here And that interferes with the capacity to enter we with the other person.
So somehow we need to get more grounded with ourselves, with our own feelings and...
I think that's often the case, and it goes in a way to ways to teach empathy. I mean, one is to be more mindful of one's own inner world, which both teaches us things about the inner worlds of other people, so we become more skillful, and also helps us become more at peace with, more familiar with, or more centered in, if you will, our own self, broadly defined. And as a result, we can then feel centered here and okay here, even as we bob up and down, in the waves with that other person's world over there.
Mm-hmm. So it's that centeredness and mindfulness that seems to tie in with the Buddhist work that you've done.
It overlaps it. I think a lot of roads lead to Rome, and I think Buddhism is definitely a major highway. Rome being, in this case, let's say mindfulness. Many other roads. I mean, I was trained in both the human potential movement originally and various practices there, and then more formally in clinical psychology. And there are many aspects of that have to do with mindfulness. It's really a matter of knowing yourself. Know thyself. That's an old and ancient saying, right? And to be redundant. And so I think that what we're really talking about here is a capacity to be empathic with oneself. I think empathy for others begins with empathy for oneself. And that means a capacity to sense beneath the surface in oneself, as well as, obviously, in other people. In other words, to sense the softer hurt or vulnerability or feeling of woundedness or despair under the surface of anger or frustration or aggressiveness coming at us, for example, or to sense that in ourselves. To sense conflict, to sense the ways in which, for example, on the one hand, we want to, let's say this evening, we want to work on our book. On the other hand, this evening, I'm speaking about myself now, we just want to relax because we're a little fried, but to be aware of both of those and to be able to tolerate ambivalence, to tolerate complexity, to tolerate depth. I think that's a key aspect of self-empathy as well as empathy for the other person. I use the metaphor. You want to know another metaphor? Mosaic. I use that one all the time as I think about it. I think about people and myself as a mosaic with many tiles, and it's easy to get caught up in a reaction to or zeroing in on just one tile in ourself or, let's say, the other person, and miss the fact that there are all these other tiles in the mosaic that really complicate the picture. It's not just one thing. And I would say that view, that metaphor, mosaic, the mosaic metaphor, is very consistent with both modern, neurology with regard to the structure of the brain as this major network full of nodes. Let's call each of those nodes a tile in a mosaic, or recurring coalitions of synapses that associate with certain aspects of the personality. Let's say the part that is goal-directed and really wants to get the job done, in my case, or the part that's like a little kid that really wants recess and summer vacation. That notion, by the way, of complexity is, as I said, very supported by Western psychology and Western neurology, and flies in the face of, to some extent, this cultural idea of the monolithic self, that the I is just one thing, the person is just one way. No. People have all kinds of layers. They're a mess. We're all a mess, right? We're all this human parfait. It's a jungle in here, right? It is an ecosystem up here. We have really happy little elves, and we have scary tigers, and we have everything else around it, right? That's the psyche. That's the mosaic, to use a different metaphor. And that metaphor is also very consistent with the Buddhist view that deconstructs the psyche and finds no absolutely self-arising I in the middle of all that. So
it's a bit, for the mosaic, you need to step back and incorporate all the tiles to see the whole?
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to say here, I'm going to put it, the reason why I was trying to make that point, and why I think it's actually useful above and beyond whatever intellectual interest there may be in it, is because it really supports the notion that there is complexity in ourselves and in other people. And to be truly empathic is to appreciate complexity and to be open to it and to engage a kind of investigative process. I think a lot of what empathy is in practice is feeling, listening, looking beneath the surface, and being open to the deeper and deeper, which means younger and younger, and which means also more vulnerable and more emotional and less verbal layers that are involved in producing the surface expression of the mind.
So that part of going into having empathy for yourself, how do you kind of take that journey to create that empathy?
Yeah.
It seems very like maybe a starting point for.
Well, I've thought a lot about that, in part because it's actually hard for many people. And I've thought about it, in terms of sort of neuropsychology. How do you do that? Or, particularly informed by very deep examinations of the mind. Buddhism has intense, very developed different practices or methods of self-empathy, if you will. Being mindful of very subtle aspects of the mind, or very kind of major factors in the mind altogether. So how do you actually do that? I'd say a couple things. One is you got to want it. The old joke that you may have heard it, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. It's stupid, but it's profound, and that's the bottom line. Do you want to change, right? So we have to start with, do we want to change, right? Do we want to know what's actually there? And are we afraid to see what's actually there? Many people are kind of afraid to see what's actually there. Second, I think we all need our angel Virgil. And that means, in other words, starting by activating or the felt sense of being with someone who cares about you. If you just take that step at first, I'm saying 2 steps first. Number 1, understand for yourself or remind yourself the reasons to become more self-aware. And 2, start by taking 10, 20 seconds, maybe a little longer, to bring to mind the felt sense of being with someone who cares about you. Could be an animal, a pet, could be your grandmother baking cookies when you were a kid, could be your friend, lover, mate today, teacher, maybe even a spiritual being, whatever it is, someone's with you, who really, really cares about you. That then can help a person feel more prepared to open up to what's there. Third thing is to sustain the inquiry. In other words, to stay with it, I think of experience, here's one of my metaphors again, a little bit like tracks in a song. You have you get the lead guitar, you have the rhythm guitar, you get the bass guitar, you get the drums, you got the piano, and then you got the choir coming in, then you got the horns, whatever. You got all this stuff coming in. Well, you want to, in terms of tracking experience, because that's what you're doing when you're tuning in to yourself. You're tracking your experience. You've got the body sensation track. You've got the emotion track, you've got the attitude track, you have sort of the verbal thought track, you've got the imagery track, and then you have sort of the dynamics of how those all swirl around with each other. That's just kind of a quick summary, but just thinking schematically, okay, what am I feeling in my body? All right, what emotions are associated here? Okay, what kind of attitude or stance do I have? What are my thoughts about all this, including kind of background assumptions or perspectives or views or frames? What are my frames, with which I'm looking here? What imagery is coming through my mind? And then a very useful question, what does this remind me of? What feels deeper? What's the younger layer here? What's getting stirred up from my childhood or just previous life experiences, including in adulthood? Sustaining that investigation without praise or blame, without fear and loathing, right? On the road to Las Vegas or on the road to, knowing yourself better. That's very important, to stay with that investigation. Right? And then I'd say the last thing is talking about it with with an appropriate person can often be very helpful. A friend, a loved one, a mate, a parent, your therapist, your teacher, or whatever, God, as you conceive of that, that also can be very helpful. It can make it more real for you, and you can even discover things. I'd say one last thing, actually, a great way to discover how it is for you, if you can do it, is with that appropriate person to be self-empathic, live, right now, without editing. In other words, as you're sharing or talking with someone here and now, what are you experiencing inside yourself? What's surfacing? What are you becoming more aware of? And can you speak it? Can you name it live here and now to the other person who, ideally and very importantly, is accepting, non-judgmental, just being present with what you're saying. Later, offline, you can maybe sort out some of the pieces, particularly if what you're saying implicates the listener in some ways. But in the moment, at least, when you're doing this kind of relational self-empathy, the other person is mostly quiet and mostly just a sounding board. But their gaze, their eyes, they're nodding, you're nodding as I speak. Those things can help us become more aware of ourselves.
So it seems to be having kind of an empathy buddy, imagined or real, in that effect, and then having that arm over the shoulder that gives you that sense of connection.
Yeah, that can really help. Mm-hmm. And there's something kind of human about telling another person. But the point is, it's easy to slip into the master's thesis about your own mind. I know a lot of people who could write a master's thesis about their own mind, and it makes no difference. Because in a funny kind of way, they're actually not very in touch with themselves. They've got the words, they've got the theory, they've got the concepts, they can talk New Age, or they can talk psychoanalysis, they can talk, positive psychology, they can talk Buddhism, they can talk fill in the blank, but they're not actually really grounded in the felt sense of it as they speak it. It's difficult for them to feel their truth as they speak it. All right? And when I say their truth, I don't mean the ultimate absolute truth, but whatever is the truth for them in the moment.
Yeah, I find that truth, which is an emotional, energetic sort of a truth, and for me that kind of comes out the most in dance, where I can be most free and with my whole body.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to, I think, put it too, to move beyond. I think a lot of self-empathy, if you will, is nonverbal. It's useful to appreciate the fact that the volume of the parts of the brain that deal with language processing for most people on the left side probably comprise the volume of roughly 3 or 4 fingers. That's about the volume, of the language centers of the brain. But the volume of the brain altogether for most people is about 5 cups worth, of tissue. So imagine a quart and a cup, 5 cups, right, compared to 3 or 4 fingers like that. Most of the brain is dedicated to nonverbal processing. So a lot of what we're trying to tune into in ourselves and in the other person is nonverbal processes. It's not about just tracking the inner language of the other person or the inner language of yourself. That's a tiny subset of conscious experience and a really tiny subset of all the dynamics, including unconscious dynamics, in the mind of oneself or another person. That said, to go further, in terms of expressing our truth to other people, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of expression of truth to other people, again, is not verbal. And I think it's also a way to discover one's truth is to play with the movement of it. What is it like, what does it feel like right now to be you? I mean, do you want to curl up? Are you scrunched? Or are you leaning in? Or are you excited? Or are you slumped? Moving your body in these sorts of ways to map to associate with, to express how you feel inside can help you discover how you really feel inside.
Well, one thing I was wanting to also look at is kind of the narrative of your life, and if you kind of look back from growing up to now, how has your kind of awareness of empathy, of the word empathy and the experience of empathy kind of evolved? For example, were your parents very empathic and you learned a lot of empathy from them? And were there any kind of milestones where you kind of learned insights along the way?
I think factually, from a very young age, my first memory, I believe I'm not yet 3, and I was playing around with my sister and banged my head on a metal mattress frame, split it open, needed stitches. So, and as part of that, my mother was driving me to the doctor, probably the emergency room, where they were going to put some stitches in. And I remember being in the car with her, having a deep sense of what was happening for her. Her worry, her tension, her intensity, her alarm, and internally over here, what was arising when I was this little kid was, in a sense, wanting to reassure her, based on really being attuned to what was happening for her on that drive to the ER. And so my first memory is really organized around empathy. So I think just factually, people, while there's a universal in the normal brain, human capacity for empathy. There's less of one in the autistic brain, if you will, and I think there's a disturbance to the brain in that population of people. That said, certainly empathy for humans. Some autistic people, like Temple Grandin, have extraordinary empathy for animals, which is really quite interesting. So anyway, my point is that even though there's a general inclination toward empathy, I think there's a natural variation probably at birth, just as there's a natural variation in temperament at birth, intelligence at birth, and so forth. I'm probably at the very high end of the scale of natural empathy. So growing up, I always felt quite empathic, and that became a major factor because empathy can be a burden, right? You can really feel the suffering of the people around you, and yet be helpless to do anything about it, and simultaneously watch them do the things that make themselves suffer. All right? There's a saying in psychology, witness at the execution, which is an awful place to be, where you just have to watch and you can't do anything about it. So that, I think, was a factor for me, and that's where I think the Buddhist teachings on equanimity have been very helpful for me about that, and I think can be a real offering for people who by their nature are very empathic or sensitive or really tuned into others, or tend to be coupled to the state of mind of other people quite tightly, so that the other person zigs, they zig too. If the other person zags, they zag too. And the Buddhist teachings on equanimity have to do with the recognition that they include the recognition, among other important parts, the recognition that other people are that are, how can I put it, that person over there, as a way to say it, is the nexus, any moment to moment to moment, of 10,000 causes upstream that are flowing through that person, very few of which have your own name tag on them. And actually, few of which have the other person's name tag on them, but they're just happening, right? They're just flowing through that other person. So yes, empathically you feel for the suffering of the other person, but also you have a recognition that their suffering is their own, and it's caused by many things, and in fact to some extent it's caused by that other person themselves, and that's the way it is. So it's the capacity to hold that recognition while simultaneously being empathic and kind and as helpful as you can reasonably be to that other person. I think that's a major part of psychological maturity. So for me as a kid, then I just to answer your question, to finish up succinctly here, then I went through a lot of training. I went to college young, and in 1969 I was in college, and BAM, Human Potential Movement, lots of opportunities to learn things about the mind, one's own mind and the mind of other people. I did a lot of trainings in my 20s that were very intense of various kinds, having to do with understanding one's own mind, the mind of others. So at this point I think, and then I would have to say in the last 10 years, neurologizing this has been extremely powerful. I would say exposed to contemplative perspectives on the mind and the deep analysis of the mind that you'll find in different contemplative traditions, really all of them, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, certainly Buddhist and Hindu, even the shamanic traditions as well, have a deep analysis of the mind. But then along comes neurology, in addition to clinical Western psychology. And boy, the more you understand about how the brain works, it gives you a very powerful insight into the mind. If only, for example, to use the example I used previously about empathy, when you realize that there are these three overlapping and intertwining, but three basically quite differentiatable neural networks that have to do with simulating action, simulating emotions, and simulating broadly defined thoughts, that suddenly tells you lots of things about empathy and about how you can train empathy, how you can recognize strengths and weaknesses in empathy, and so forth.
Okay, is there something you feel we should cover that still about empathy, some kind of aspect that you feel is important still to cover?
I think it's useful for people to appreciate that they have a profound capacity for empathy. I mean, we evolved arguably based on the reproductive advantages, which is the engine of biological evolution, certainly over the last several million years, the reproductive advantages of empathy. Because hunter-gatherer bands that were competing intensely with other bands for scarce resources, as well as competing against other, predators or other, actors who in the food chain and so forth. Bands that had a little bit more empathy genetically, because bands mainly bred within the band, were able to outcompete other bands that weren't quite as empathic and thus pass on the genes of empathy. And this process became then, a positive cycle, because then as you pass on those genes and you have more empathic grandchildren, they become even better at teamwork with each other, and they pass on their own genes even better, and so forth. And the degree to which that got involved in the evolution of the brain in terms of language capacities, which are an important part of empathy, emotional signaling, what's called the social engagement system, in terms of facial expression, eye expression, subtleties of eye expression that are very involved in empathic reading of others and empathic communication of what's happening over here and so forth. Anyway, very powerfully, empathy, and this is what's called the social brain theory in science, empathy and the cultivation of empathy and the capacity for empathy and the inclination to use empathy has been a primary, arguably in some circles the primary, driver of the evolution of the brain over the last several million years, during which time it has tripled in size. And much of the tripling of that volume is devoted to capacities that intertwine with empathy. So I think it's helpful for a person to realize how naturally empathic they are. And then, second, to really play with it as a skill, to realize that empathy is a skill. A person can become more skillful with empathy, just like they can become skillful at, a foreign language or learning how to use some new gizmo on their computer, or more skillful at putting in golf. It doesn't really matter. You can become more skillful with empathy than you've been before. And then last thing I would say is that empathy is a subject that can be negotiated in relationships. In other words, it's just like it's okay to negotiate how we're going to spend money or raise the kids or load the dishwasher or do sex. It's also okay to negotiate and talk about and put on the table wants related to empathy. Right? Why not? It's just like anything else. So if you want more empathy, or if you're dealing with a partner who would like more empathy from you, that's a subject that can be negotiated. And then you work with what that really, really means. I work with couples dealing with that frequently. And I think one key part of it is to really say what you want. And then on the other hand, if you're on the receiving end of some wants for empathy, to really appreciate that actually a little empathy can go a very long way. That actually very often what your partner wants, they're not a black hole. They just want 20 minutes in a row of real presence. 5 minutes in a row. I deal with couples routinely where one partner wants more empathy from the other. Often, not always, often the female member of a heterosexual couple wants more empathy from her male partner. I've seen it frequently, actually reversed the other way, but that said. And he thinks maybe that it's like some kind of bottomless pit, but actually 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes a day of real presence and listening and engagement would just, oh my gosh, make everything so much better.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.